Tom, welcome to the show. It's great to get you on, mate.
Thanks for having me, Andy. Pleasure to be here.
As is tradition, always get people to go through their background first. Obviously, you and I have spoken a couple of times recently, but just for the kind of audience's benefit, do you mind just walking everybody through kind of who you are, what you do, and give us the sort of backstory of where you've been career-wise through to today?
Yeah, sure. I'll skip over the unnecessary bits, but I guess the relevant parts and probably akin to much of your audience. So, sort of sports science undergrad and postgraduate degree. From there, was looking at the wider world and sort of understanding what does the career look like, and very much from those type of studies, I wanted to try and transition into working with professional athletes. And I'd always been a really big fan of Formula One and motorsport in general, and was very interested in trying to embark on a career in that particular sport. The problem was there was no obvious opportunities. There wasn't necessarily a sort of a company or a network or a way in which I could go and work in that sport. And at this time, it's probably the early 2010s. Twitter was probably in its heyday, and you could look at maybe what some coaches were doing. And I sort of spotted one or two that were active in Formula One and managed to reach out to them and understand a little bit more about what goes on in the sport. And from there, I actually managed to like look around, search high and low for opportunities, and I found a gym that was based next to London Gatwick Airport, and this gym specialised in the physical prep side of supporting racing drivers. So I managed to get an opportunity there and was kind of let loose straight away out of university. So I was given the keys to the gym, and basically everyone that came through those doors was under my supervision, and very much a wide reaching role. So multifaceted, so physical prep, soft tissue therapy, nutrition, etc. And I felt quite significantly out of my depth. So I was working hard trying to understand where my gaps were, working with other people in other sports as well alongside, and just trying to learn about the sport because at this time we didn't have much in the way of quality peer-reviewed research. I'm working with drivers from go-karts up to sort of Formula 2 level and everything in between. And there's not really a standard per se in terms of what level these guys and girls should be at from a sort of physical prep perspective. So very much learning on the go. And eventually I got an opportunity to start supporting some of these athletes at races. So again, very multifaceted role. Everything that fell under, sorry, the sort of performance and well-being umbrella inherently became my responsibility. And again, just trying to learn as much as I can while on the fly. And then in 2018, I got my first opportunity to work in Formula One directly. I'd already worked with a number of athletes that had made it to F1, so I had an understanding of what drivers needed to be doing. But then I was traveling to every Formula One race, supporting one of the athletes in this, what is termed a performance coaching role. So again, this kind of jack of all trades, master of none, but very much approaching it from a perspective of bringing in experts in different areas to help support me as the person on the ground supporting this athlete. And generally, Formula One is that sport where you've got 24 races at the moment across 23 countries, 5 continents, constantly on the move. And because of the logistic restraints, there's generally just one performance coach for each of the now 22 Formula One drivers, which is a bit backwards when you think there's over 1,000 employees per Formula One team and only one person per driver. When we consider how important the driver is in that whole scenario, it's quite amazing that that's the way around it is. But that's what we're working with, and that's largely been my career right up till December of this year, where I finally left that role. So I've had over 12 years in that sport and loved every minute of it. It's been a phenomenal experience and insight into a world that I dreamed of working in.
Yeah, and it sounds like you had a really good formative experience in that kind of earlier role in a sort of gym near Gatwick. Because I think if you work in, at least in the UK, if you work in, say, football or rugby, you're spoilt for choice in terms of the number of teams and leagues and therefore kind of like junior opportunities through academies and age groups that you can get into. to work your way up to the the big league, if you want to call it that. Versus, I can imagine Formula One, short of having quite rare places like that, doesn't have that breeding ground for coaches. You're sort of either in it or you're not, I'd imagine, for the most part.
Exactly that. And I think one thing that was interesting with my sort of upbringing and sort of almost launch into professional sport and a practitioner role is I went in straight into self-employment. So I didn't go into your typical team sport environment where you're sort of a junior and you're working under lots of people. And I guess it's always a case of it's a grass is greener type scenario. I'm sure there's people in team sports that would have loved the freedom that I had, but I was looking at it almost from maybe an insecurity perspective of like, God, I've got no one to learn under. And I think that's a very much a unique kind of component to my sort of start in this sort of coaching capacity. And I'm very grateful for that because imposter syndrome, I'm a firm believer of, can be very positive. And I certainly felt like at most points in my career that I had that, and that was actually my drive to actually try and find out more and try and wherever I could learn under other people. But yeah, like you say, it's not the saturated sport that perhaps many sports suffer from. It's still very hard to get opportunities, but at that particular time, there wasn't a vast array of coaches doing what I was doing. So you could quickly find the people that were doing it, and they immediately became your compatriots and colleagues. And I think that helped drive a lot of what our now understanding is of that sport. So many of my friends and colleagues have sort of written the textbooks and have headlined the peer review papers in this area because it was not long after that I got involved did these sort of things start really accelerating, and Formula One has become even more global than it was before. And we've got things like the Netflix program, which have given everyone an insight into what kind of goes on, which is new to a lot of people, and it's sort of broadened it as a appealing sport to the masses. And yeah, it's there's now a lot of people that want to try and work in it as such.
Yeah, it definitely. I mean, it definitely glamorizes, I'm sure, the and overlooks the parts of the sport that I know will be brutal travel wise. I think Drive to Survive is great, right? Because I don't know, every 5-10 minutes it cuts to an entirely different continent, country, place, time zone, obviously. I know you've got a big interest in jet lag, and it's not shocking to hear where that might have come from. But I'd love to know why you. Obviously, I know you've been very exposed to jet lag as a performance, something that can have an impact on performance. But can you kind of talk through like what about jet lag it is that you find interesting, and it sounds obvious, but why does it matter to you?
Yeah, so for me, I was in this sort of multifaceted performance coaching role, trying to understand the problems that my athletes were facing. And most of those were sort of addressed very, I guess, typically. Like you would spend time with a rehab specialist if you had a particular concern around a particular type of injury, or you're just trying to learn how other sports do certain things. And um, when I actually started in Formula One, I got a bit of education in jet lag by an expert in the area. And I was then reading around in the area of sleep in general. And this is, again, late 2010s at this point, probably 2017, 2018. And sleep is becoming a more well understood thing that performance stakeholders are taking an interest in. And I was reading a lot and sort of seeing this process C that kept rearing its head in sleep research, which is the circadian system. So often when we look at a paper that references sleep or jet lag, we will talk about process S, which is this homeostatic drive for sleep or sleep pressure, and then this process C, so the circadian system. And I guess it was that sort of initial reading combined with my interest of then this form of circadian disruption called jet lag that allowed me or sort of pushed me to want to read more. And the more I read and asked around, the more that I saw this discrepancy between what we would perhaps read in a paper and then what was applied in the real world. And also, I saw that there was a lot of gaps in the research, and that led to me starting my professional doctorate in 2021 in jet lag, travel fatigue in elite sport, because I just felt, based on personal interest and nothing more, I felt that this would probably accelerate what I could provide my athletes more than, say, anything else that I was looking at that time.
Yeah. Um, I guess the key question is, how do you assess it? I think jet lag's one of those things that, probably in quite a trivial way to someone with your knowledge, we've all experienced and have our
Mm,
own idea or misconceptions of what it is, what it's not, rumors of things that help it. I'm sure you've been asked lots of trivial questions about, sunglasses, red light therapy, all sorts of products and gadgets that you can wear on a plane. But I'd just love to know, like, from a kind of scientific and practitioner lens as well, how do you assess it? You've got athletes or coaches that are going to be
mhm.
experiencing jet lag. How do you sort of monitor it, assess it, and look at it?
Yeah, I guess the best place to start is a bit of a mechanistic understanding of how jet lag occurs. So we've got this master clock known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN for short, which is located in the hypothalamus, situated above the optic chiasm. So we've got this body clock, this endogenous clock that regulates everything from our sleep-wake cycle to essential living functions. And the most popular, if you like, circadian rhythm, for most people, the one that they always think about is the sleep-wake cycle. So you've got this body clock, the SCN, and that's like your conductor in an orchestra. And then your musicians are kind of like your peripheral clocks, which reside in almost every cell in the human body. And these are entrained by this master clock, but things like food timing, exercise, light, and more have an influence. So in the case of sleep, that would be very much the case there, that other things can also influence them. But fundamentally and importantly, an out of sync clock can lead to what's known as circadian disruption. And this is, or leads to, and is very well documented in impairing markers of health and physical and mental performance. Some examples of a type of circadian disorder or disruption are shift work disorder, social jet lag, and then jet lag. All of them have relevance and are very much of the same thing. There's just bits of nuance that kind of separate them, and I'll come to that in a short while. But how do they happen fundamentally? Well, it comes from this body clock getting out of sync with time cues, otherwise known as Zeitgebers, a German word meaning time giver. So we have many different Zeitgebers: exercise, socializing, eating. But the one that's perhaps most documented and well understood from having a big influence is light. So that would be light from the sun and electronic sources of light. And mistimed cues with the body clock is what leads to these circadian disruptions. So now jumping into jet lag. Jet lag is defined as the catalogue of symptoms associated with rapid travel over multiple time zones caused by this sluggish adjustment of the body clock to the timing of the new environment. So it's the body, the human physical body, then getting mistimed cues, which is causing this desynchronization. So in the form of jet lag, you're seeing light, you're exercising, you're eating at the times that your body is fundamentally not used to. And this leads to symptoms, from a jet lag perspective, of impaired physical and mental performance, poor mood, disturbed sleep, which is kind of the obvious one, increased fatigue, and even things like gut irregularities. But we can use these Zeitgebers, these time cues, to actually entrain our clock to actually minimize jet lag as well. So if we take control of the time cues, we can actually manage jet lag better. Now, critically, jet lag is only possible when we travel in an east or west direction, generally speaking, over two or more time zones in an east or westerly direction, known as transmeridian travel. If we were to jump on a plane and maybe travel from a central US state down to certain parts of South America, we might be on the plane for 10 plus hours, but we might not necessarily cross many time zones, maybe less than two. So we wouldn't have typical jet lag in that scenario. What we would have is huge amounts of travel fatigue, more than likely. Now, travel fatigue is a separate phenomena to jet lag, and it's defined as the non, or it's loosely defined as the non-specific response to the hassles of travel. So I think most people that have jumped on a plane would have experienced this. It's your queue at passport control, it's the stress of visas, and it's running late for your flight. It's the when you get on the plane, it doesn't get any better because you've got a cramped seat. I'm 6'4", so I'm quite used to sort of folding myself into that tiny seat. It's the hypoxic environment we find ourselves in with the fact that we've got a pressurized air cabin and generally less oxygen in the air. So that's going to increase our need for more fluid replacements. And all of these things contribute to a level of acute fatigue. But the good thing with travel fatigue relative to jet lag is a good night's sleep in the new environment generally will dissipate most symptoms. So if you can set yourself up well, minimize the stresses as much as you possibly can, and then get a good night's sleep when you arrive, most of that travel fatigue should have hopefully dissipated. And that's the key difference between travel fatigue and jet lag, because jet lag is not the same. We would expect acclimatization rates of around half a time zone to one time zone, possibly up to 1.5 time zones per day when we're shifting in an east or westerly direction. So what that means is if we're traveling over, say, three time zones, we might take up to as many as 6 days to actually fully acclimatize to that time zone. Now, that's perhaps not assuming that we're putting things in place to be able to sort of lessen the blow, but also sleep is usually the thing people think about most with jet lag. So if I'm sleeping well, I've got no jet lag, and that's the common train of thought. My problem with the stereotypical sort of jet lag scenarios is we're not usually thinking about the full picture, and I see this in pro sport a lot. So I'm going to give you a case study example. Take an athlete that is traveling tomorrow, one time zone eastwards. So they could be in a central US state traveling to, say, New York or on the East Coast, or someone perhaps in the UK traveling to Paris, France. Same scenario. So you look on paper as the coach, maybe, okay, we've got one time zone, eastward direction. That's no jet lag. So we're all good there. We haven't got to think about the circadian system much. But I'm going to throw in a few other things. So we know that this particular athlete has got a late chronotype. You've run a gold standard questionnaire, maybe the composite morning questionnaire or morning eveningness questionnaire, and you understand that this athlete is an evening type. Coupled with that, you understand as well that they're a gamer. They like playing their Xbox or PlayStation till 1, 2 in the morning. So the next day arrives and you jump on that flight, and that athlete arrives in this eastward time zone, which is earlier in the day. When we travel eastward, we make the day earlier. Thrown into the mix as well, the game time is also 2 hours earlier than the athlete is used to. So now we've moved 2 hours further in terms of when his body's going to have to get, his or her body for that matter, is going to have to perform in that given time zone. So whilst we haven't seen classic jet lag, we've got this circadian disruption cocktail of both social jet lag and jet lag. So for clarity, social jet lag is generally speaking the desynchronization between your work and kind of study schedule and your free time. And this social jet lag plus jet lag has created more of these circadian disruption type symptoms, only they've gone under the radar because of this case that we're only traveling over one time zone. So this is where a lot of my passion for the area has come from, because a lot of us are not maybe looking at it through this lens. And then it gets kind of more interesting still when you look at diurnal performance in across the day. So what I mean by that is we look at, say, a marker of performance, whether it mental or physical, and understand how it varies across the day. So testing multiple times a day, controlling from many different variables. And to give a few examples, there was one of the earlier studies by Atkinson and Spires found that tennis serve accuracy dropped off from the morning to the afternoon but tennis serve velocity improved across the day. And when we look about why that might be, generally the thought was that because core body temperature would increase generally for most of us across the day, if we're living on a normal sort of schedule, because core body temperature is an indirect marker of the body clock, we would generally see it highest in the late afternoon, early evening. That made sense for maybe why serve velocity was at its highest later in the day. But then for accuracy, so maybe that sort of concentration and focus component, we know that this can often drop off at sort of the early afternoon point due to sleep pressure, that rise in adenosine. So we've got some insight there as to the impact within one time zone. And there's a lot of different studies that have supported this very phenomenon in many different circumstances. So another study, Pullinger and colleagues tested repeated sprint ability in males and found that nearly all markers of performance were improved from a repeat sprint perspective in that early evening period again. So following core body temperature. But other areas, so complex decision making, there's a general theme that there's a drop off after the morning, early afternoon period, which a lot of us are very kind of familiar with. We know as well that chronotype has an impact. So in a lot of these studies, morning people generally adapt worse to like afternoon and evening activity. So with all these things combined, we recognize that there's a lot to consider when we jump over time zones. That doesn't necessarily change the picture completely because all of these things clearly apply when we're in a single time zone, but they become much less clear when we jump east or west, even just by a single time zone. So that's a bit of a tangent, but it's kind of a lot of the mechanisms behind this area and one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it, and also how I believe it's really going under the radar with a lot of different sports and athletes.
Obviously, there's different sports with different schedules, which is an obvious point to make. But you've got sports like Formula One, where to some extent everyone's got the same schedule, right? Like everyone's pretty much traveling on the same days. Competition's always on the same day in the same place. So driver versus driver's pretty much the same in terms of what they're exposed to. Then you've also got different sports like the NBA, where it's across a large continent, and if you're a team based on the East Coast, Central, West Coast, different schedules, different location at their home games, different away game schedules, probably very different like levels of exposure and like whether it's going to have a good impact relative to other teams or not. I'll bring this home in a minute. I know this is a wild tangent. We're obviously like in a strength and conditioning capacity, we're always really interested in like neuromuscular fatigue, and we're quite often doing wellness questionnaires and counter movement jumps on force plates and just looking at outlier scores, are they fatigued, all these kind of like common things. I'm sure this is a really overly simplified question, but is there any sort of like rules of thumbs that you think about in terms of what might be a normal-ish level of decline in neuromuscular fatigue in these kind of common ways that we might assess it relative to each time zone that you cross? And I'm sure that varies per athlete. I'm sure it
Yeah.
depends on the test and all these different nuances. But is there any sort of like quick and dirty rules of thumb where you sort of say one time zone 10% or whatever it is?
Yeah, no, I guess I need to refrain from the very easy answer, which is it depends, because that's, yeah, it's our least favorite when we're asking these questions. But to give you some like overview of this, there's a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's a few good studies which have reviewed like mass data sets from the big American sport leagues. And these are really interesting studies because you've got the US, which is separated with from east to west coast in terms of like a 3 hour time span. So we've got some classic jet lag scenarios there. We've also got lots of different sports. So they've got like NBA and MLB, they travel a hell of a lot. NFL slightly less so. And there's a lot, yeah, I would highly advise people go away and try and have a read of some of these studies because they're really interesting. In particular, one that springs to mind by Galinsky and I forget the second author, but it's a US based study group in 2022. they looked at the NBA and they found that free throw shooting when traveling from east to west coast was decreased. So there was a 1% or 0.8% performance loss, which wasn't statistically significant, which I think is interesting again, because if you present those numbers to a coach, they're still going to want to like know about that. That particular study did show statistical significance, though, when they removed the players that took the most free throws. So if you took out your LeBron Jameses of this world and your starting players, and then focused on just the players that were sort of only taking a couple of shots a game, that then became statistically significant at over 1.3%, I think it was, if I remember rightly. So why would that have been? So in this particular scenario, the authors thought that because effectively those East Coast teams traveling westwards were basically competing at a time that was even later than what they were used to. They were basically competing at almost a biological time equivalent to midnight. So they passed that period where we might see sort of peak levels of performance. And actually, for good measure, they've probably got some sleep pressure thrown in there as well. So coming back to your question more directly, I guess we can do things like counter movement jumps on arrival. We can even do like an RPE rating of a particular like movement or exercise, whatever it may be. The problem is, as we know, performance is so complex and a single score can have so many contributing variables, whether it's nutritional,
Yeah.
to do with the level of warm up, just the psychological side alone is going to be like, there's so much to unpack there, isn't there? So we can't really generalize. And I think that's also because of, if we go back to that example I gave earlier of the late evening chronotype that's got to travel one time zone eastwards and then the earlier game, for that person, they're probably going to have some red flags in some of their score data, or they might do. But if you've got the early morning type who is getting up readily early. Maybe they're a young parent as well, so they have to get up early anyway. They may even thrive in that same scenario. So it's not like you can look at an athlete and say, okay, this is the trend that we're seeing here. So let's apply like a widespread protocol. And I think that's one of the tricky bits from some of the peer-reviewed work to then the application. And we don't have too many people in this space that have kind of that, yes, there is some applied research here, but trying to actually work with athletes and understand and coaches and understand impact is quite tricky in this space.
And I guess like so you end up in this situation where it's inevitable. You're traveling east or whatever the travel situation is, and you know they're going to the athlete and the coaches are going to accumulate some jet lag. How do you intervene? And because I think this is probably the key thing. Everyone listening. It's the so what question. Okay, so we know it
Mm.
happens. What do you do?
And I think this answer will probably underpin why a lot of people probably feel like they don't do that much, because the reality is we can't measure the body clock directly. We have to look at indirect markers. So we've talked about one indirect marker of the body clock already, and that's core body temperature. The problem with getting gold standard sort of core body temperature readings, which you will need to do to identify, for example, if the body clock has shifted at all, or to what severity of jet lag you might have, or other forms of circadian misalignment. You're going to have to use something like core body temperature pills or a rectal thermometer. And neither one of them is particularly practical and quite evasive. So invariably we end up not using these objective markers to identify maybe the sort of, we don't approach it in the same way we would approach a lot of other sort of considerations, right? So we then move to subjective means, so questionnaires, and that's probably that single word there is probably the bane of like a lot of coaches' lives, because there is no end of questionnaire that all of us would like to use, irrespective of like your skill set and bias. The problem is clearly we're dealing with like athletes and the time that they have and willingness to want to complete something. And the gold standard sort of jet lag questionnaire, which is generally perceived to be the Liverpool jet lag questionnaire, is not a quick thing. and probably you're going to have to use it over repeated trips to start to understand maybe trends, and it's not going to be the easiest thing. Then you've got things like your chronotype questionnaires, which we've covered already. So you throw in all of that into the mix, and it's kind of like, well, we could do all this, and we just might not get like the level of information we need. It's yeah, it's time demanding, it's difficult to get buy-in, and of course, it's still only the subjective side of the coin. So we're not necessarily moving the needle to the discrepancy between that and maybe objectively what's going on under the hood here. So it's that for those very reasons, I think that's why we struggle to see teams regularly applying sort of practice in this area.
I guess at the end of the day as well, there's nothing you can really do in terms of like the schedule. You can't turn around to the league and say, "Hold on, we think we're going to pick up jet lag here. Can we play a different day or different time zone?" Like there's to that extent, you can only assume they're going to be exposed to jet lag. There's nothing, you can't like take that away from them. I know you can probably change the day you fly out potentially ahead of certain
Mm.
competitions. There's those sort of logistical considerations that you might be able to get over the line. I guess what in terms of like things that are more accessible, low hanging fruit, what are some sort of strategies that you deploy to help with jet lag?
So if you think about what the available options are for coaches, athletes, etc., you've got utilizing experts, consultants in the field, bringing them in some capacity. Um, that's definitely an option, and quite often the route people go. The problem can often be with that is similar to the questionnaires, etc. You need good buy-in, and if you're not going to be able to give that to the respective person, it can often be a bit of a fallacy that they can make a meaningful difference. Um, Most of what that the evidence would suggest, the peer-reviewed work in this area would suggest is looking at lifestyle changes. So things like managing your light exposure, your sleep, making sort of changes to eating schedules and things that will facilitate the shift if you need it, because important to recognize as well, there is a lot of supportive evidence around the importance of sleep regularity for sort of health benefits and sort of to reduce risks in sort of all-cause mortality. That's a really strong emerging area right now, and I think we shouldn't be looking to try and shift all the time just from a performance perspective. There's also that side of the coin. But in terms of other sort of tools, there's things like apps, websites, and kind of to date, they've been quite good in terms of they give some guidance, but it will be quite generic, one size fits all, doesn't really accommodate sort of those scenarios that we've run through earlier. And then there's the whole pharmaceutical topic, which, yeah, first thing to say is I'm not an MD, definitely not medical advice, but we know with a lot of them, they come with complications, contraindications, in the form of like the hypnotic medication. They're not going to most of the time be like actual circadian shifters. So effectively, they might knock you out, but you're not going to move that body clock if you need to. And there's some in the world of melatonin, there's some concerns over like quality and assurances over availability, particularly with over-the-counter available like stuff that you can pick up in health food stores. Um, so there's a lot to unpack there, but fundamentally there's limitations with the existing sort of solutions. But I think it's still like relying on people that can translate the research the best, probably to work with organizations to understand the important nuance and context for their travel. And I think most of the time, what needs to really be considered is when are you actually performing in the new time zone? When do you need to be at your best? Because Formula One's a great example, right? We fly to places like Singapore and Las Vegas, but we're not really acclimatizing to the Las Vegas or Singapore time zone because they're night races. And our time of performance is different compared to the European season when we're like typical race time is 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So when you've got these things to consider, I think the context is really what matters, and that's what really needs to be considered as part of any advice that teams are receiving.
Yeah, no, really well said, and a perfect segue as well. Obviously, you're not just a a passionate believer and applied scientist of jet lag. You've got skin in the game, you know, yourself, trying to make a difference in sport with it, with phase. Tell me kind of about what phase is and how it kind of helps teams, because I think this is kind of where you're taking science, evidence, and experience, and actually trying to make a meaningful, change to athletic performance.
Yeah, so this is kind of the doctorate project that's got a bit out of hand because I was kind of just going through one of my studies and looking at sort of education level within different cohorts when it comes to jet lag and how people were applying certain strategies. And I was noticing a trend, and I guess it's that classic. You pass your driving test, you do all the practice, you pass the test, but if you don't then own a car or have access to a car for many years, you kind of lose a lot of what you learned initially. And with jet lag, the problem can often be you may only travel a couple of times a year, big flights, and encounter it. So knowing what to do consistently is very difficult. And this was one of my bugbears, kind of trying to help people and teams was there was almost an over reliance on coming back to me. It was quite difficult to sort of help teams become self-sustaining with it. The other part of it was an actual moment that happened where I was working with a European sports team, big team that was traveling out to LA, and I was brought in to try and help support them, and they said, look, we'd really like sort of some good level support and try and give us something to try and help with our acclimatization. And I said, yeah, in principle, happy to help. And I then asked for, well, can I perhaps understand a little bit about what the players have been doing before travel? And they were like, oh, we don't get them for another few days and like 1 or 2 days before they travel. I was like, okay, well, I know questionnaires are tough, but can we ask maybe a couple of questions which might help identify a few things? No, we can't do that. Okay. And then it was a case of also the head coach wants everyone to be doing the same thing. I was like, okay, at this point, I think you have to recognize that we're not going to be able to do a great deal. There's going to be no aspect of personalization. And truth be told, it's not going to be much better than sort of a chat GPT effort almost to help support your given team. As much as I'd like to help, I just don't think I'm really going to be able to make a difference here. And very clear that that was not the fault of the team. Like we've all, if we've worked in pro sport, we know how difficult it can be to get things like questionnaires or just any data at all from our athletes to understand what we need to be doing. So yeah, get in line really for people that want to get something from your group, right? And I think that's where the idea for a product came from because I was realizing that me as a consultant didn't really work that well beyond N of one. It was very difficult to really help people beyond just one person at a time. And even then, it still had flaws. So when it came to understanding what the product should be, it needed to be able to get some context about the body clock, like try and help profile. It needed to be able to provide personalized advice, nuance based on personal situations as well. So if they're a young parent and they're having to get up early, like they're clearly not going to be able to wake up at 9 o'clock in the morning, even if they want to help with their jet lag and start shifting to a new time zone early. There's certain restraints that people have, and it's important that all advice considers the real world sort of application. Um, Critically, though, it's important to upskill and educate in real time as well. So the given product needed to be able to help with that. And fundamentally, and the critical final piece is it had to have some level of control for the coaches and for them to be able to feel empowered with the strategies that they were putting in place. And that's where we landed on sort of an app or something that had to be with the person or the people that were traveling all the time, really work best as the solution, combined with something like a web platform for the coaches. And that's fundamentally how Phase was born. It was out of this desire to try and help solve that problem. And That was in 2023, the original ideas and the patent that we submitted. And we're now in the current day where I've only just recently left my Formula One coaching role and I'm full time in the business. So yeah, it's been a bit of a like this conversation, well, like me talking, it's been a bit of a tangent that's got out of hand and I've gone down a few different rabbit holes, but I'm enjoying it and it seems to be having a really positive impact so far.
Yeah, I think it's a path well trodden, isn't it? Where people, practitioners, go into a PhD and go really deep into a very specific topic, and then out of that comes a solution that can help the field. I think that's a pretty well trodden PhD turned product path that comes from a really good place and then has an impact because it's come from a scientifically validated approach. So
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would have to say that unfortunately, the doctorate in the last 12 months has definitely had to take a bit of a back seat because I was in a
sure.
position where I had my full-time F1 coaching role. I was trying to really put, we had our what's called our MVP, so our minimal viable product out in the real world, working with lots of different sports teams last year. So we were sort of trying to improve the product and learning with real people at the very highest level of various different sports, and something had to give. So the idea was I left the F1 coaching role this at the end of 2025, go full time with Phase, and now thankfully I've been able to sort of pick up where I left off with the doctorate 12 months ago. So we got there eventually, but it did mean that it had to take a bit of a back seat for a little while.
When do you think the PhD will be wrapped up? Do you are you brave enough to say? Or
Yeah, next year. I think one thing that I'm going to do is, because it's a professional doctorate, not a PhD, so it's being done very much as trying to advance our understanding in a given area in the field. And one thing I'm actually looking to do is do an extra study now with Phase, so to really tie it all up nicely, um, help sort of bring the validation to the product, but also really make my prof doc and my sort of startup very much synergistic, which will help a lot with the time spent on it. That's definitely been a good learning of mine over the last few years is try and make your sort of various sort of professional endeavors sort of two birds, one stone as much as you possibly can, because the plate spinning can get a bit treacherous otherwise.
well, mate, it's been. I wish you the luck with finishing the PhD or the doctorate. That's no small feat, and I think by the nature of how a lot of people in sport probably listen to podcasts, I've no doubt there's when this goes out, there'll be somebody listening to this sat on a plane thinking about jet lag, listening to you educate them on jet lag at the same time. So I think this could be quite a captive conversation as to when people listen to it. But yeah, mate, it's been great to sort of learn from you today, and yeah, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Cheers, Andy.